Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Doomer Optimism podcast. Just me hosting today, Ashley, with Jonathan Askonas. I'm going to have John introduce himself and talk a brief biography, where he is and what he's up to. And then we're going to jump into his Compact Magazine essay called Why Conservatism Failed. Lots of conversation lately about like what's conservative, what's liberal. And I think it will be a really good and illuminating conversation. So thank you and welcome.
Thank you for having me on. So I'm Jon Askonas. I teach politics at the Catholic University of America. I'm also a senior non-resident fellow at the Lincoln Network, which is seeking to kind of bridge the conversation between West Coast technology thinkers and East Coast policy folks. I'm an academic, rare bird. Did my undergrad at Georgetown and then graduate work in the UK. At Oxford, my research area is on military innovation, but I'm also interested in the kind of broader social and political effects of technology and reviving or recovering strands of thinking about technology which were important in the 20th century, but which haven't really been prominent in American conservatism, maybe ever, and certainly not recently. And that's kind of where this essay came out of.
Yes. Okay. So let's just run through. I'll have you run through like the basic arc of the essay or argument of the essay. We can go in more detail about like specific points you make, but let's you just set us up. Like what were you arguing basically?
Yeah. So the essay came out of a kind of sort of a cri de coeur or a cry of frustration from I spent a lot of time talking to folks in the conservative movement. Some might even say professional conservatives, not just people in policy or think tanks, but also people in academics, usually in political philosophy or economics. And many of those conversations with conservatives, they highlight the same kinds of things you and your listeners probably talk about on Twitter.com, although probably with less emphasis on like slonking eggs and whatnot. But there is the assumption that yes, things are bad right now in this way or that, but that make a few tweaks to the sails and we'll be back, steady on. The problem that I encountered was, and in the original version of the essay, it's a lot more theoretical. The folks at Compact are great at helping me kind of chisel it down into more of an arrow. But is if you take seriously the idea that traditions are not ideas. They're actual sets of practices and institutions which meaningfully can reproduce themselves. Then this way of thinking and arguing about conservatism doesn't take into account the real possibility that traditions can die, or traditions can become irrelevant or anachronistic. And the person who really makes this argument most stridently, of course, is Karl Marx, for whom I think many conservatives are afraid of Marx as some kind of bogeyman, which, if that was understandable in the 20th century, is absolutely silly in the 21st century when we have much bigger problems to address in which Marx can help us understand. And for Marx, of course, the bourgeoisie, the class that builds and sustains modern capitalism, was completely different from all other preceding ruling classes because it subordinated its social position was due to its ability to generate profit. And so it had this incentive to always be revolutionizing the social and economic means of production in order to increase profits. And this is a kind of self-undermining activity that, but which before it undermines the bourgeoisie, will completely revolutionize society. Marx thinks that the revolution that's to be wrought by the proletariat, seizing the means of production, etc., is actually the second important revolution in world history. The first revolution being the revolution of the bourgeoisie, sweeping away sort of all preceding social structures. So the essay, Why Conservatism Failed, takes a much different tack. One of the things that frustrates and annoys me is that we often argue about the conservative movement in terms of different thinkers, which thinkers were right or wrong about various things. But the point I make in the essay is that my essay's criticism is completely different. I don't argue that any particular conservative thinker was wrong in their thinking, in their way of approaching ideas. but I just think they've been historically superseded. They had a project that depended on preserving tradition, and that project has manifestly failed. And so the second part of the essay turns to where do we go from here? And I argue that we need to take seriously that this realization requires us to take seriously the problem of technology and the need to build technologies that create the futures that we want to live in, and at the same time to fight against those technologies which destroy the futures that we wish to live in. So that's the essay in a nutshell.
Yes, yes. Okay, so the first thing that comes to mind is, so I've been like getting all these mixed messages lately from people, and I think probably it's because we live in a super chaotic ideological time where people can't figure out like what team they fit into, and everything feels like team politics, and then or team sports, like your ideology has to fit neatly into something. We want to know whether or not you're with us or against us, like because that kind of gives people a sense of security, I guess, like are you a safe person with whom to ally, you know, that kind of thing, which makes sense. And it is so confusing in the age of the internet to like just know who your ideological allies are, etc. I think that what you were saying about this obsession with thinkers actually gets us in, and thinkers and ideas gets in the way of us really understanding like what's underneath these thinkers, what like lines through, and something that that just came up this morning is I'm critiquing these Just Stop Oil protesters, because I think what they actually fundamentally underneath believe is that we should just cover mountaintops and solar panels and eat like that factory food. But then there are people who are like coming after me and say like, why do you dislike environmentalists? You're an environmentalist. You're on our same team. So I think I hope you're seeing like the parallel I'm trying to draw, where there's all this confusion about who thinks what, because there's like these heuristics that say, oh yeah, I'm a Marx person, or you know whatever would be like a clear indicator on the right, you know, that I fit into this like team politics. But I think there's something really deeply dysfunctional about that, at least in this moment, when you have very complex factors and you almost need to simplify down to like what's underneath them, and not necessarily just like in-group signaling, if that makes sense. I'm wondering your take on that.
Yeah, I think, I mean, a lot of the overarching our political system and our way of talking about political problems, you know, the things getting in the way of a good life for ourselves, our families, our people, is channeling all this discussion through the internet. Now, you know, I'm in another essay I've recently written, a series I have in the New Atlantis called Reality and Postmortem. I'm trying to kind of articulate why consensus reality is broken down and why we're living in a world of fragmented realities. So I think it's important not to just view things as line on the internet, that we had a century of increasingly intensive mass mediafication preceding, and the internet is kind of the apotheosis of this longer trend. But one result is that the world's information is universally available to us, and it becomes impossible to make sense of in the kind of common sense way that we make sense of problems in near to us. And so one way we make sense of it is we simplify and we symbologize. And I actually think Christopher Lasch, actually, in The Revolt of the Elites, talks a little bit about this. Mm-hmm. The way that the elites respond to kind of complexity. First elites, and now I would argue everybody, respond to this kind of complexity by replacing the kind of complex underlying reality with the symbol, and trying to manipulate that symbol and manipulate reality via manipulating that symbol. That's basically what politics is today.
Yeah.
Adam Curtis, actually, the British documentarian, in a number of his works, has also, in his own way, gotten at this point. And so that is one of the things I'm trying to draw attention to, is that in addition to the conversation about what ideas are right, we also need to have a sense of priorities. And one of the problems with channeling politics through the internet, is that our sense of priority is driven by what is immediate, by what is engageable, by what is emotionally enticing, and not by what's actually making a difference.
Yeah.
And that's true on both sides. That's not a political partisan critique. That's true on every side of the aisle, so to speak.
Yeah. Just like I was saying with the environmentalist stuff, it's just increasingly team sports because you can't keep up with like what's underneath the full argumentation unless you know a lot. Some, like, for example, I know a lot about George Monbiot. I followed his whole arc. I know that he's like an extreme eco-modernist now, but not everybody knows that. They just see George Monbiot and they think environmentalist. He probably agrees with what I think. So, okay, in that spirit, let's talk a little bit about the actual traditions or the vision for a good life, or what or maybe let's do the doomer optimism arc. Let's talk about what we don't want, the doomer part, and then let's talk about the optimism part, like what would we want to bring back more of. But let's stick in the critique part a little bit, the critique of technology. Sure. What the ideas behind that, and bringing in some of the thinkers too. But the one thing that I just want to briefly bring up is that in my dissertation, I drew on Marx and Polanyi a lot. And both of them have this pretty strong critique that, more or less extreme industrial capitalism separated people from nature, like a connection to their actual work, which would be like the means of production, but like controlling things with their own hands, their own existence with their own hands. So nature, work, and then community, one another, just taking us out of like these interdependent, sort of almost self-sufficient communities and into like a faceless worker position. And I still think that this is really good. And one of the only thinkers who has pulled out Marx's environmental strain his name is John Bellamy Foster, and he wrote a really long paper going through like all of Marx's work and showing how much he was against industrial agriculture, and how he talked about how it pulled peasants off the land and away from the means of their own production, this kind of thing. I think this critique's extremely powerful, and I think there's other thinkers on the right who have had similar ideas. So let's talk about the critique, the doomer part first.
Absolutely. I mean, so what you just said reminds me of this summer and going forward, I teach a seminar on the philosophy of technology called "The Machine Has No Tradition" with Nathan Pinkowski and Mary Harrington. And as part of preparing for this, I was reading Das Kapital with an eye towards gender, because I had an intuition about it. And one of the things, I'm not going to name names because I don't want to, they're friends, I don't want to criticize them, but I was listening to a conservative podcast the other day with some people I respect, thinkers I respect, who were talking about, the communist ideas about gender and the ways that communists want to revolutionize gender. But talking about Marx specifically. And there are, the conversation about Marx and feminism is complex, there's a complex history there. But the idea that Marx wanted to abolish the nuclear family as such is a little bit misguided. Marx thought that capitalism abolished the nuclear family as such. He has this amazing section, and I think it's in chapter 15 of volume 1 of Das Kapital, where he looks at, among other things, all the ways in which infants and children are torn out of their mother's arms by capitalism. He talks about children being addicted to opiates in these factory towns in the north of England because their mothers will give them opiates because they can't breastfeed them because they're working in the factories. And he goes on about this. And you could say he's being polemical, but his method is the thing. This is what's so silly about cultural Marxism as a prescription, is that Marx's method is not idealist. He's not looking at changes in ideas. He actually is incredibly scornful of that approach to studying history. He's looking at changes to material life.
Yep.
And that's what's shaping his analysis. Same thing with what you said about the environment. I haven't looked at that, but I'm not at all surprised to see that. I mean, there's an argument to be made that all Marx is doing is applying an Aristotelian understanding of labor and community to the actual material conditions of industrial capitalism. Um, so, and again, and this is in my essay. This is where I really kind of go after the conservative movement. The conservative movement was, remember, the conservative movement predates industrialism to some extent, right? If you look at folks like Edmund Burke as the early conservatives, what they're concerned about is protecting the actual existing social order against revolutionary ideas. So revolutionary liberalism, progressivism, kind of the use of scientists and ideology to say we have a better way of organizing society. We're going to impose this better way of organizing society on society. And conservatism wasn't unsuccessful in fighting back those ideological movements, right? I think you look at the history of anti-communism, of conservative resistance to progressivism in this country and other countries. At the very least, it's if not a winning record, it's at least conservatives gave as good as they got. But in the process, they completely ignored the changes wrought by capitalism to the underlying material environment. Mm-hmm. So, in the United States, if you read all early Cold War thinkers, they contrast the Soviet revolutionary change to family life, the dissolution of divorce laws, widely available abortion, men and women working at very high rates, the state raising children in daycares, communal living. They have this like Soviet experiment in radical changes to nuclear family in contrast to God-fearing Americans, 2 parents, 2.5 kids, etc. Right? Well, sure, the Soviets, the communism didn't change American family structures. But if you look at any of the evidence on American family structure, it's radically changed. It wasn't changed by ideology. It was changed by the pill. It was changed by the 2-income trap. It was changed by the changes to divorce laws wrought by these other social changes. So the focus on technology and the focus on the material is another kind of critique. You can win. You can be right about the ideas, and you can even to some extent win on the ideas in the public space. But technology underneath it all will still be changing people's incentives, changing their behavior, and then eventually, Marx would argue, and I would agree, changing their ideas. The Marxist view of the change of ideas is that people's incentives change, their position in the economic and social system changes, and eventually they generate new ideas that make sense of the changes they've already lived through.
Yeah.
And frankly, I think that is at least as powerful a way of understanding, quote unquote wokeness, quote unquote cultural Marxism, as anything else.
Yeah.
But conservatives are still focused on arguing about these completely marginal thinkers, but they miss this underlying change.
Yeah, I think a lot of us, at least in the doom or optimism sphere, whether we're right or left, are fundamentally historical materialists in that we're just like, okay, there's like certain like material changes that have happened, whether a lot of us are peak oil people, but also just like the advance of different technologies leads to certain social outcomes, and then people backload explanations. This is like totally obvious to me. Mm-hmm. Like they try to like backload that it was just an ideological warfare, and of course Weber is more makes the argument that like the material world interacts with ideas in like more of a push and pull, more so than Marx does. But we just realize that I think most people are like lean heavily in the direction that they're describing the arc of history by the fight for ideas, and I don't necessarily think that's true. And what's happening now is that we're at a point, I would argue we're at a point, and most of the Doom or Optimism podcast, I think, or our guests would argue we're at like a historical turning point where the material world is changing in significant ways. And specifically, I think a lot of us think there's this arc of industrialism that goes up super strongly, changes everything about turning up more or less a world of traditional societies into a world of industrial societies at different scales of industrialization. And now we're on some kind of peak and downslope of that, having lost all these traditions and looking to recapture them. and feeling really lost and like, how do I get back to this world of anything that resembles tradition. But I think most of us don't think there is any going back, but more like some synthesis going forward. We don't have to go back to 1750. There's a lot of things we've developed and invented that can continue going forward, but there are like hugely historical materialist consequences for just the world we live in now, like what's going on in Europe. All these resource contractions, like people are so confused about what's going on, and they act like it's a fight for ideas or something, as if there aren't material limits to things. Like one of the things we talk a lot about is like, globalization of economics and supply chains and energy is like a historical anomaly. Just assuming forever world peace to just get your basic energy was not a great strategy. Like no one in human history would like ever really did that. And now we're facing the consequences of that. And people are saying like, oh, it's just because of war or something. And they're not thinking about like the underlying historical. So I don't know if you share that perspective at all.
Well, I definitely share the perspective of the history of ideas. I mean, that's the sort of feeling of frustration that led me to write the essay was, as a student, I participated, and even as a faculty person, participated in a lot of the kind of conservative seminars. For some reason, conservatives in the United States think that, we need to teach our young people how to reason from first principles in political philosophy. And the left doesn't do this. And when they teach their people how to think about like activism and policies, wonky policy questions. And when I was like an undergraduate, I thought that was like a point in favor of conservatives, and now I'm pretty sure it's the other way around. So this way of thinking about the world is completely brain dead as far as I'm concerned. Or at the very least, we need to go very, very far in the other direction before we come back around to the question of ideas. And also, we need to ask whether ideas and symbols are the same thing. I've been reading some Eric Voegelin recently, and I think he's a pretty marginal figure in conservative thinking today, but I think he has some interesting insights on this question. Yeah, I'm with you. And
I like to hear just
something you said about recovering
the ideas versus symbols question. I haven't heard that before. I'd love to hear even just a brief explanation of what you mean.
So Voegelin has this. So I'm reading his memoir right now, and he set out to write. He's a political philosopher, really interesting guy, unbelievably erudite, the kind of thinker. Actually, and funnily enough, it was actually reading this memoir that also got me thinking about this question, because he displays a level of knowledge and sophistication that was not unheard. He was distinctive in his time, but it wasn't rare to have someone like him who spoke probably, at least 4 or 5 languages, was familiar with primary texts across, Near East civilization, classical civilization, through secondary literature, Indian and Chinese civilization, not to mention the whole history of philosophy, German idealism, the whole shebang. We don't produce people like that anymore. Right. The top thinkers in our universities, including conservative ones, very, very, very rarely approach this level of erudition. And Voegelin himself thought that he was nothing compared to, and maybe he was right, people who had preceded him. Right. So there's this, he was raised in early 20th century Vienna. In some ways, the sort of Vienna circle that also produced, Hayek and Polanyi, both Polanyis, and many, many other great thinkers, Wittgenstein. But he saw back and he thought that German education at that time was actually far degraded from where it had been in the 19th century. So, one of the ways in which we are struggling in the twilight, to borrow from George Grant, another favorite thinker of mine, is that we don't even realize how far we are already fallen, intellectually and otherwise.
Yeah.
But anyways, so he goes out. Voegelin sets out to write this history of philosophy, really comprehensive. But he realizes at some point that there's no way to integrate. No one has sought to integrate this trend, the history of distinctly philosophical thinking, going back to like say the ancient Greeks, and the broader forms of cosmological thinking that have been part of human civilization since like the Paleolithic and the Neolithic, at least.
Yeah.
And then this leads me to ask why not? Why have we missed this very rich part of the human experience in our philosophizing? And his answer essentially is that with the German idealists, and he particularly fingers Hegel, we transformed what he calls symbolization, which is how we convert experiences that we actually have, including experiences of the divine, into ways of communicating about them with each other, into ideas and concepts, these like inert, abstracted things that are kind of outside of us that are manipulable. Mm-hmm. And that this is the key thing: don't speak to reality. So for Vogelin, a symbol is a kind of bridge between an actual underlying reality and experience, including an experience of the divine, and a person who can experience it. Mm. Whereas an idea doesn't necessarily actually connect to any underlying reality. So he calls Hegel a sorcerer because he seeks to create this perfect system of ideas, which is closed and perfect in its relationship to itself, but doesn't actually touch reality. And he thinks Hegel seeks to change reality by changing human society so that we are manipulating these ideas and changing our relations with each other without regards to actual any underlying realities. Oh, that's my kind of amateur summary.
No, yeah, idea. I love that. And actually something that comes up a lot in our podcast is, and just in general, I think of people thinking about these things is, like you start going back in history and you start thinking about the different kinds of alienation we've experienced as humans, just like either alienation from culture, and then eventually it always just ends up with like, yeah, it all started with writing, where you're just like, it's it was just a process from basically the Paleolithic, where maybe this is where we evolved in this like tribal community where we had like constant commune with nature and other, to this like long process through history of like just being more and more alienated from whatever that source experience is, just and then accelerated with the rationality and the scientific revolution, just trying to control everything.
Although I mean Vogelin thinks that two interesting points to make about what you just said. Vogelin thinks that, I mean, he basically says that what Hegel is doing is trying to convert his own particular mode of alienation into a system of philosophy, and that this, it basically sticks. So I think the alienation we experience from when you're living in a pre-industrial society, you're limited in the kind of alienation you can experience from reality. But around the time of Hegel, you can quibble about the specifics, but you enter into a point where you can increasingly live in a purely human social world, right? In a way that now, like many of us, particularly in the West and developing world, our experience of the world, unless we intentionally seek something differently, is primarily one of kind of artificial environments constructed by humans.
Yeah.
So we can reach levels of alienation that are simply not possible when you're living close to actual agricultural production, actual like making of things, engaging with reality. The other point, which I think is a good way of describing the essay, is this point about writing is first made by Socrates, by Plato, where he talks about how writing destroyed memory and it's dangerous memory. And as far as I can tell, most of Western quote unquote philosophy basically ignores this point. It says, oh, this is interesting that Plato said this. Obviously, we're not going to get rid of writing, so let's just move on.
Yeah.
And what you see in the 20th century with thinkers like Marshall McLuhan, Vogelin, Eric and Walter Ong, is they basically say, well, what if Plato was right? Like, what if we take seriously this idea that there's this fundamental change that occurs? And that's sort of where media ecology begins. So media ecology is a bad name for what is actually just serious thinking about technology. So that's where this essay begins, in a sense. I mean, it seems undoubtable that writing did obsolesce any number of traditions, not least the great poems. At the same time, it also made possible to preserve those poems over long. There are epics, there are oral epics written by peoples whose names we don't even remember that have been completely lost to time because they didn't have writing.
Yep.
But we still have the Iliad and the Odyssey, and the Epic of Gilgamesh. So this is why I think conservatism is kind of NGMI, not going to make it, but where that's okay. But we can still achieve real human values if we grapple with the problem of technology and move forward on that basis.
Yes. So okay. I want to get into like the optimism side, but I don't think we've ever had this conversation on this podcast, and I'm super curious. Like, okay, so if we do take seriously the assumption that writing does alienate us from, oral culture to some extent, what do we do going forward as moderns? Is it an act of resistance to I think sometimes I think about this, a lot of times people had conversations or wrote essays, which obviously is another layer of abstraction, but having conversations, like I think about these long form interviews in like the 50s and 60s, early mass media, where the conversations were a form of working out ideas together, and they were kind of like it. Oh, did I go away for a second?
Yeah, I'll hold you for a second.
Okay, all right, I'll go back. So these conversations in like the 50s and 60s on mass media were like a way of working out ideas, together with and you could be wrong, but you're working it out in like an oral form. I wonder if you have any thoughts on that, like, how do we resist this desire? I almost feel like there's also just this churn of op-eds, and the op-eds have to like, everything now, all this media now, it's like it's not even reporting as much anymore as just like singular op-eds, which I think are even less useful than like a conversation like this where you're kind of working things out together. The op-eds are just like, here's my take and I fit into this group, and we're all making this like take machine or whatever. I wonder what's the way to resist that.
But this is a good example of kind of what I'm talking about. I mean, so the underlying technology has shifted the meaning of social relations. So like, journalism after social media and the internet is not the same journalism it was before. It could not be, right? You literally cannot understand the meaning of a lot of what goes out in major newspapers today without understanding the specific like online discourse that they're trying to engage with, right? That wasn't true 20 years ago, but it's true today.
Yeah.
So you have to ask, how do we go? You can't just lament, the decline of journalism. You have to think about, where do we go from here?
Yep.
It's funny, as you were describing that kind of oral culture of the 50s and 60s, I was thinking about what we're doing right now.
Yeah.
I mean, what we're doing right now on this podcast is the recovery of that way of thinking. And I think the rise of podcasting has been super interesting to see. At a time when a lot of media is getting much more ephemeral, podcasting, because you carry it with you, you can listen to AirPods while you're walking around or doing chores or driving in the car, has lent itself, sort of like talk radio before it, to longer conversations. It's not at all unusual you have 30-minute podcasts, but you also have, Joe Rogan 3-hour podcasts, and you have a lot of longer conversations that result from that. And a lot of it is 2 or 3 or 4 people working something out. So I think that's great. And I think that's a way of proceeding. So then the question becomes, how do you shift the kind of center of gravity in the culture away from things that are more hot takey, things that are mediated more by, as you say, team sports than by actual thinking and talking and figuring out. And that's some of that is going to depend on kind of entrepreneurship and shifting business models, business realities. Some of that could depend on norms. Norms are weak but sticky and powerful. Some of that could depend on policy. Like, I think personally, here's a hot take, I think the U.S. government and any government should have a policy of actively degrading the quality of social media to make it useless and boring so that we stop engaging with it in the way that we do.
Yeah.
Or changing how we engage with it. Yeah. Right. Yeah. So that's the kind of thinking you can do if you realize that. So, I mean, Neil Postman once described himself as a technological determinist, by which he meant Not that we are. He pointed something out, which is that you're usually accused of being technological determinists if you think that technology just is going to do its thing and there's nothing we can do to change it, and we have to just kind of sit back and take it. But he pointed out that an actual technological determinist is the opposite, right? At believing that changing the material structure of the environment is actually a wonderful thing for human agency. Because it means that if you can affect the technological base of society, you can actually change society.
Mm-hmm.
So being a technological determinist means you actually think we can do something about these problems.
Yeah, I feel really strongly about that too. I think, yeah, there's a lot of media theorists, and Neil Postman among the greatest of all time, who I think, yeah, I think provide like great options for us thinking about this going forward. I'm just wondering, like, I mean, as it is now, there's just so much incentive to just keep it going in this crazy direction. And one of the things that that a lot of us are grappling with is whether or not there is a possibility for almost like relocalization. And that doesn't necessarily mean physical, although a lot of us are physically doing it too, but like relocalizing into smaller, more discrete communities that have some boundaries to them, that have like some, I mean, it's almost like a network state Balaji thing, but like the idea of like maybe having these communities that have like almost like a monastic option or like a Benedict option, like seceding and making our own little norms that are like, we're sick of this chaos. And then maybe even having situations where you have meetups of people who are like in this seceded group, and they like deepen their relationships. Then there's the alternative, or the critique of that, which is that you can't run away. They're just going to keep coming for you. That, it's all going to keep coming for you. You really have to change the system. You can't like secede from it necessarily. So I wonder if you've thought about those strategies at all.
I've definitely thought about this. Absolutely thought about this. I mean, this is what I'm trying to grapple with in this series for the New Atlantis, reality postmortem. I've got 3 essays out. I think I have 4, 5 or 6 more to go. I mean, I think the underlying the technology is pushing us in that direction, right? The technology has obsolesced the mass media business model, basically. So it's brought into the fore subscription-based business model. So you're more rewarded for the loyalty of a small number of people than for the kind of like blasé attention of a very large number of people.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, example I like to use is, increasingly controversial rap genius Kanye West didn't release he only released his last album, Down to 2, via this thing called a stem player. It's like this little widget he made with Kano Computing where you can manipulate the music as you listen to it. What's interesting is he said basically that this was a more economical, like, so it's expensive, a $200 stem player. And I think he sold like 6, I did the math, like 6 or 10,000 of these devices to his most, people who like are willing to drop $200 basically for a Kanye West album. Well, if you look at streaming returns from Spotify, you'll see that he made more money, like 6,000 people paying $200 made him more money than, 60 million people playing his songs a few times.
Yeah.
Right. And those kind of dynamics are increasingly common across the spectrum of any kind of activity, including creative activity. So we are, I think, only at the beginning of realizing the possibilities of this kind of business model, and that will shift the ecosystem towards fragmentation, as you've said. Smaller communities, more loyalty, more buy-in, and then more value add too, right? Because there's also this network. One of the big things venture capitalists have been talking about recently is that network effects go in both directions, right? Network effects help you scale because they're adding, every new person in the network is adding value exponentially, but they also works in the reverse. Every person leaving the network massively decreases the value you have. So as more and more people derive more and more value from these smaller communities, it also saps whatever value remains out of that kind of more mass approach. I mean, I don't know about you, but I don't watch any like blase broadcast
No.
mass media anymore. Like I have no idea what's on my local news channel.
Right.
Right. I know a lot more about like esoteric Twitter discussions than what's going on with like my like Channel 11 news or whatever the broadcast news is. So that's where we're heading. To the question about, what does it take to protect yourself within these communities? That's a complicated question, I think. I think looking at what happened in Canada with the trucker protests is very illustrative.
Yeah.
Which is that it's increasingly easy to, or also frankly, what's going on with even at a very high level, very different level, like the war between Russia and Ukraine. It's increasingly easy for the powers that be to control access to this kind of global network infrastructure that they built over the last 70 years. Financial networks, internet networks to some extent, production networks, etc. But the actual generating and sustaining direct coercive power is a lot more expensive. So in the case of Canada, right, it's way easier for the Canadian government to like cut everyone off from the entire banking system than to pay the actual and political cost of mobilizing the riot police against this protest. So, one practical piece of advice you might have is that to the extent that these communities can actually sustain themselves at a material level, it becomes more hassle than it's worth for the powers that be to like mess with them, possibly. That's one takeaway.
Yeah, so we've been thinking about this a lot. Like, Tucker Max has been on the show a couple times, and he keeps telling me he's got this ranch in Austin, outside of Austin, and he's like, he's like, Ashley, you keep saying we, and like, who is we? Like, maybe there is no we. Maybe it's just like, me and my people in my ranch, in my community. And he like literally is getting to the point of like self-sufficiency within the community, also building his own school for his kids because he didn't like what was, what was going on in the public school. Not he, but the people in the community didn't. And so they decided to make a Waldorf school together. And so let's go into this, the optimism on the material side, because this is basically primarily where our focus is on, with practitioners. It's like homesteaders, small farmers, people who are looking at alternative education, like actual material sovereignty. And then I would say just what goes hand in hand with that, if you're really trying to do like a secession, is like just illegibility. You're not trying to go against the regime like the truckers. You're just trying to like almost not be seen. You don't even really want to draw attention to yourself. And a couple of times I've asked Tucker to like talk about his projects. And he's like, I'm not going to talk about it. I'm not going to talk about there's so many people who want me to fail. And I think that's really smart if you just think about like just not being important enough for anyone to really care, is a great strategy. But yeah, let's talk about the material side.
Well, just to that point briefly, and then I'll kind of give a bigger overview, but there's an interesting way in which it's become easier than ever to be illegible, which is that as certain tools for legibility become so predominant, social media, but also like certain forms of like large databases that third-party brokers sell to anybody who wants them, anything that doesn't show up there, like the skills, the actual discrete skills of penetrating illegibility outside of those easy to use systems have kind of fallen away. So like, even the practice of like actually getting someone just journalists to actually fly down and see what's going on, that requires a lot of effort for might not be, and the number of news outlets that can and would afford to do that have decreased massively.
Yep.
So, to the extent that you can just kind of keep your stuff off of the internet, which actually isn't that hard to do if you intend to do that, you become illegible much more quickly as well.
Right.
Which is
people
interesting.
Will pick the low hanging fruit, like in terms of, I'll just go seek out information for some person who's just putting it all out there, as opposed to going to seek out your information when it's way harder to get.
Yeah. I mean, there's my friend James Poulos has this mantra, which I think he got from somebody else I know, that the digital retrieves the medieval, which is this like, it's kind of esoteric media theory point, but one of the interesting retrievals is like the value of esoteric activity, esoteric writing, esoteric organization has come back, right? It really wasn't for a lot of the 20th century. A lot of that value add kind of maybe wasn't there, but now it's got returned as a way, for example, for this case of like mediating the how am I illegible to outsiders but legible to the people who I want to find me, which is like the classic question of esoteric anything.
Mm-hmm.
And the age we live in is one in which there's a clear answer to that question.
Yeah.
To the broader optimism point, I mean, the point of the essay is that we shouldn't be afraid of technology. We have to give up on this sort of tradition versus progress because tradition lost. We just need to build things that are good and focus on building things that are good, and including things that incorporate or revive practices that are historic. And in some ways, once you can kind of like look up from the doomer stuff all around you, we should be very optimistic, right? We have more tools and more knowledge about more of human history than anyone else in our history ever did.
Yep.
Right? We can actually look back to, not just our own cultural traditions, but actually a huge swath of cultural traditions around the world throughout history, to find things that are useful for us. And if we adopt this kind of attitude, then I think we should be optimistic about our future.
So one thing that has been plaguing our little circles lately is, I think, almost a team sports when it comes to tradition, like what tradition to look back to. Are you Catholic? Are you Greek Orthodox? Are you, I don't know, looking back to the German Romantics? You know what I mean? So it's like, which team are you in? Where are you looking toward? And so I wonder if you have thought about that much. My take is kind of like we're in this weird zone where we're trying to recreate things, and like I think that some people have like a silly argumentation where they think something like, if you reject modernity, you have to or any aspect of modernity, it makes no sense unless you reject all of it. So you can't like get a C-section. I was just tweeting about this the other day. It's like, well, nobody would ever not get a C-section if they're going to die or their baby's going to die. Nobody would ever do that. But then on the other hand, we don't want to just like overuse C-sections like we're doing now. So it's like one of those things where it's kind of like the way I move forward is like so almost personal to me and very eclectic. Like there's just a whole suite of things that I look toward tradition for, but then accept some aspects of modernity. And they're like almost like on a case by case, what are the material conditions of my life that determine that outcome for me? But I almost feel like we're shooting ourselves in the foot where we're like trying to adopt the whole of whatever X, Y, or Z tradition as something that's the team I'm going to look back toward. But it's, I don't know, some of it's lacking for modern problems, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. It's, I mean, that's such a good example of this exactly the kind of thinking that's just completely useless in my point of view, because it doesn't understand, right? What's the implicit argument there that if we rejected tradition, if we rejected modernity, tradition would just like spring back? I don't think that's true at all. Right. Like this is like, it's a difference between, this is the battle of ideas. This is the problem of idealism, right? You think that because you have a picture of an American chestnut tree in a book, that you could just revive it. No, right. It's extinct. Sorry, you can't revive it. If you wanted to, you couldn't. In fact, the only way you could revive it is with new technologies, which is another conversation. But I'm pro bringing back the bison, pro bringing back the megafauna, pro bringing back the American chestnut. So what you're doing is actually better, right? Because the mistake of the quote unquote traditionalist, or I should say the mistake of tradition, because I actually think a certain kind of traditionalists, the so-called perennialists, has a better grasp on this problem, even though they're kind of weird and esoteric and mystical, than the kind of normal Burkean conservative types. So their problem is this thinking that tradition is to be that tradition. They'll often describe something as a living tradition, but we've become unbelievably inattentive to whether that's actually true. Whether the institutions, practices, virtues, incentives, whatever, are still there. for the tradition to want to uphold. And when you actually look, you discover more often than not that they're not there anymore. And some of this is quite recent. It's died out in the last 2 generations, or maybe more concerning, it is dying out now. Like, you look at the number of traditions where their best practitioners are in their 60s and 70s or 80s, it's a very high number. And so right now it looks like, oh yeah, we still have great blues. And blues actually might be a bad example. I think there's some great young blues musicians, but, or, maybe certain kinds of woodworking or whatever. Mm-hmm. And you say, oh, we still have this, we can still do it. But then you look at who are the practitioners, and there's not a younger generation coming in to replace them now. Yeah. And as a result, we can confidently predict that it will die out, even if it looks healthy-ish today. But if our goals, so that's the problem with the traditionalist. The problem with the modernist is to assume that, like, if you accept some of the good things, you have to take the whole package. There is a kernel of truth to this, which is, if you want to have a materialist analysis, the thing existing does change the material incentives. And you can't just wish that away or you can't wish that away. The technology is not neutral. At the same time, even if maybe you view it as not a good trade-off, that we destroy certain traditions or ways of doing things in order to learn something about the world and be able to manipulate it technologically. Once you had that capability, you had the capability, right? So I think the way to proceed is, as you said, to actually have a sense of what's good. This is what I say in my essay. You should actually have a sense of what is good, what you believe is good for humans and what is bad for humans. You should try to adopt technologies that enable you to do the things that are good for humans, but also adopt them with an eye towards the total effect of the technology, right? So that does mean that there are some technologies that are maybe not bad in and of themselves, but so change incentives that you might want to throw them off or limit them, right? One of the challenges we have is that it's difficult at a high rate of technological change. It's difficult to develop cultural norms and practices that limit the use of different technologies. To the point where it's almost not even worth talking about because it hasn't really been done. That being said, really strong communities, and usually religious communities, have developed these norms. I think the Amish are a good example. The ultra-Orthodox or Hasidic Jews are another good example. To some extent, Al Jacobs has argued that Eastern Asian cultures, like Shinto cultures, Confucian cultures, at least in some ways, show this ability to just constrain the use of technology by developing cultural norms around it. So I think there's a way forward.
Yeah, and I think even of a version of, I think of some of my friends who do stuff like I'm just not going to use Twitter in this way. I'm just not going to let it take over my life, and we're just going to set up a norm where that's just not. Some of my writer friends will say, I have it set up where I only see comments from people I follow, because I'm not going to just subject myself to the horde. You could use a technology in different ways that are better or worse. And I think that we see more of that. One example I think about all the time is I went and visited this tribe in the Skagit Valley in Washington once, a Native American tribe, and they were talking about they're trying to reinvigorate some of their cultural, heritage and practices and foods. And so they were saying oh yeah, we're trying to do more gathering as a part of our, re-embrace of our heritage. But then they were working with the local Washington State University extension agent to get good berry cultivars of the best. They're not going to not go get the best berry cultivars. Why would they do that? They're the tastiest and the easiest to grow. So it's one of those things where it was a very nice mix. And I just thought this is lovely, they can embrace a traditional approach to food and try to re-embrace some of those practices around it, but also are not going to just pretend that these cultivars haven't been bred.
Yeah, I think a lot of this conversation about modernity versus tradition is a bit silly in the sense that inside of tradition seems to do the same thing that modernity does, which is to set aside the question of what's good. If you have a sense of what's actually good for people, then that's a heuristic that lets you decide is adopting this technology good for people or not.
Yeah.
And it's that simple. eating good berries is good,
Yeah, so I'm
and we can
wondering, do you
integrate that
have
into our practices in ways that aren't destructive to those practices. So we should do that.
right? So okay, do you have a heuristic of what is good? Have you developed such a thing?
Well, I think that's something that has to be embedded very deeply within a
The
community,
place,
within a
context
religion.
specific. Yeah.
So I think of that. But one of the problems that we have in the West is that we've lost that conversation. I mean, one way of understanding the history of the West, the history of liberalism in a broad sense, is setting aside that question of like what's actually good in order to focus on kind of a process of adjudicating between ourselves when we don't agree in the wake of the Reformation. And then as it comes to us in the 20th century, we needed to set up these coalitions to oppose. I mean, this is conservatism, right? It's a coalition to oppose revolutionary ideology, where each of the people opposing it has their own different reasons. Some of them are anti-communist, some of them are religious conservatives, some of them are libertarians who like market orders. Everyone has their own kind of thing, and so what that means is that we can agree on what we don't like. We don't like revolution. We don't like imposed social change, but we don't agree on what's actually good. And I think that no longer suffices. So I think your first step is you have to, in order to have any way to control technology, you need to come together in a community that agrees on what the good is, and then agrees on what technologies to adopt or not adopt as a result. People make fun of them for reasons I don't understand, but the Amish are very, very successful at this for all their other problems. People think that the Amish don't use technology, and that's not true at all. The Amish use lots of technology. What the Amish have are very, very strong communal norms and authority structures that dictate what technologies they do and don't use and when they do and don't use them. So, for example, there are a lot of technologies, including computers, that the Amish will use in their workplace, but not at home. And they make that very strong distinction, right? There are other technologies like refrigeration that they do use at home, that they've decided this technology fits within the life of our community, and it's not going to destroy the kind of community we want to have, and it will actually enhance the community that we want to have. Yep. So there are other communities you can identify, but I think they're a very clear example of this kind of thinking.
And I would add, in my dissertation research, I talked to people who decided for various reasons that growing food for themselves and their family was good, and made a community out of that, and basically like didn't really even need to talk about why they thought it was good with one another. They just talked about the actual practices, helped each other, rehomed roosters, did all shared building plans for chicken coops, like this kind of thing, where it's like, okay, they don't have to have the most intense buy-in like the Amish or anything like that, but they're enough of a community that they help each other out. They have alternative economics, informal economies going on. And I just think like there's so much potential to get people together on this topic of what is good. And this is why I talk a lot about homesteading, homeschooling, like home economics type stuff, because it's just, parenting your kids in certain ways, like being around them to the extent that you're able to, while managing work. Like these are kind of things that I think a lot of people can just fundamentally see as good. And then the question is, how do we just make that happen in our lives and muscle through despite all of the incentives against it? So speaking of that, let's talk a little bit about this third oikos idea. And then maybe I do want to end with the the bison and megafauna, because nobody has made that case on this podcast yet, which is so surprising, considering all the people I have had a couple, we've like touched on it a little bit, but I want to hear like the case made for that. But first, let's do the third oikos idea.
So this is a Doomer Optimism exclusive. I mean, this is an idea I've had for a while, and a few people have been kind of poking around the edges of it. I mean, Catherine Boyle at Andreessen Horowitz, an actual venture capitalist, has been writing a little bit about similar themes. There's some other interesting ideas during the pandemic. So the third oikos is this idea that we've actually reached a new stage of household organization that I think in many ways is certainly superior to what came before, and presents some new possibilities for integrating technology and tradition. So the first oikos is the kind of tradition. Oikos here is the Greek word for household organization, right? It's where we get the word economics, oikonomia, the organization of the household, right? So until the Industrial Revolution, the oikonomia focused on households as it was a broader category. It wasn't just your nuclear family, like mom, dad, kids, grandma, or whatever. It was the household as the site of production. Like on a large agricultural estate in an agricultural society, many more people are involved in agricultural production than simply, the person who owns the land, obviously. And then together they form a kind of society. This is obsolesced by in the first oikos, production and consumption are occurring at the same place in the household, and there's some, obviously there's some exchange across between households, but the vast majority of consumption and production is in the same household, and it's localized. In the second oikos is the Industrial Revolution, where increasingly production and consumption are occurring in different places, like physical places. And consumption and production are also being drawn into global trade networks. So, even by the turn of the 19th century, you have after a brief experiment with the kind of cottage industry and industrial work in the home, increasingly that's being done in a factory, which is separate from the home. The home becomes because people are working in the factory all the time, they don't have the time to make things at home. So they're increasingly buying it in the marketplace. This is where you get the market for goods like candles and clothing that otherwise were always produced in the home. And this reaches its peak really in with the kind of 1950s Betty Friedan housewife, where the housewife is alone at home at a place of like pure consumption, and actually incredibly miserable as a result. And I think even Illich's writing on shadow work in his book Gender is super interesting on this question, and this like bizarre kind of alienation that emerges when you're like the one person responsible housewife for this space of pure consumption, and pure production is going on in the factory, in the office, and then not near you. And we've now reached a place though where this was probably occurring before, and I had this idea well before the pandemic, but the pandemic really accelerated it, where we can reintegrate production and consumption in the household, but in ways that are tied into global supply networks. So kind of the best of both worlds, maybe. So the obvious way in which production is occurring in the home is like telework of different kinds, but it can also be goods that are produced at home that are more easily sold via these global networks. So running an Etsy business, running a home business of any kind, forms of like tutelage, running a home daycare, where you're finding it's more easy to find someone who shares values even in the local community via the internet. So this like search cost has gone down a lot, and so this offers the benefits of having production and consumption in the home, more people at home, potentially much easier to have children, especially small children around, much easier to find ways in which the community is integrated into the home, but also gives you some of the benefits of global supply chains. And the other benefit, which I think Catherine Boyle has kind of understood, is that one thing that was holding rural communities back in this second oikos moment was the rural communities became a site of production of agricultural goods and not much else. And so if you had people who were very educated, who were very skilled, who had other contributions to make to the modern economy, they basically had to choose between being productive and staying in their rural communities. And one of the powerful things that this sort of third oikos moment or model presents is that incentive changes. You can be a research scientist, you can be a marketing genius or whatever, and you can live in a rural community and raise your kids in a rural community. So I think one of the big engines of dislocation in modernity is simply the process of mobility, economic mobility, and we may be reaching a point where we can make trade-offs in the opposite direction, where you can actually preserve some of that kind of economic mobility through telework and virtual engagement while being able to stay rooted in your local communities.
Yeah, I love
So
that.
that's the idea.
Yes, I love that. And a lot of us talk about that. And I think this is definitely coming down the pike. I think it's the future. I think it's what a lot of us are already doing. A lot of people who are in like the doomer optimism or homesteading sphere are like trying to almost it's pretty obvious to me, like even this Marxist analysis we started off with at the beginning, like the act of production and like the means of production in your own hands provides meaning for people. Like you cannot just be an agent of consumption. It's not the it just it drives you crazy. I mean, there's just like volumes and volumes from like every 20th century thinker on this topic. Like it drives you crazy. So just having the ability to like produce a little bit of something, even if it's like just taking a second harvest of apples and turning it into cider in your home is like an act of joy and meaning. And I even extend this argument to parenting and being able to be present in your parenting, and a present that's an act of creation, but there's also meaning to be had in like some kind of economic production. We think a lot about on this podcast, like I guess just what kinds of economic production you're doing. Is it email work, or is it some mix of email work and like actual manufacturing capacity? Some people are like experimenting with decentralized production models via 3D printers and this kind of thing, or like some people have been thinking about like distributed cideries or something like that, where one person makes a model or like a distillery model, and then now we have like 1,000 different distilleries in local communities, and they can stay there. But a lot of people are concerned, and this will probably just be a different topic, but a lot of people are concerned about basically like the historical process has been to empty out the rural areas and everybody goes into the cities. And now the way that it is, they're just that rural areas are so extremely empty because of industrial agriculture, basically, that is able to farm huge tracts of land without human labor. That repopulating them will cause some kind of strife, just cultural strife. And like, this is something we're kind of concerned about. Like some of the people, either they leave and go to the city and then come back. That would be the best case scenario. They come back to their home and where the people they actually know, but newcomers coming into rural areas, like it's just an ongoing question we're gonna have, I think, for the next like century, because I think people are gonna get out of cities, and then it's just like better or worse clash of culture and in migration from urban to rural.
Absolutely. And so I mean, you're dealing with a problem I thought about a lot. I'm a big fan of Wendell Berry's work, but Berry assumes the wrong word, but he's writing from the position of place and lamenting and cataloging all the ways in which it's displaced and destroyed. But he grew up in like 30s and in 1930, a significant number of people, even in America, very economically mobile, were still attached to their home places in a way. But now we're 3 generations removed from that.
Yeah.
I was talking to a friend who's he's from Herndon, Virginia. He's from no place. He's from nowhere. Like Herndon is like a classic nowhere place.
Yeah.
And what he's trying to do, which I think is admirable, is to turn it into someplace. He's moved back to Herndon, and he works in DC, and he's trying to invest in the community. But it's hard in a community which is not structured to be a real place.
Right.
My friend Gracie Olmstead is a book, Uprooted, which I recommend to all of your listeners, dealing with kind of similar problems. And I think one of the realities is, yes, it will cause strife. Yes, it will cause culture clash. But being from a place is actually good.
Yeah.
And so, obviously, as we are moving, as we seek to move from a displaced nation to a re-emplaced nation, when the process of what Simone Weil calls enracinement, like literally putting down roots where there aren't roots before, we have to do that work. And it is a little bit arbitrary. And no, it's not traditional. It's not traditional to like pick a new place and be from that place, but it's what we need to do because it's actually what's good for humans. And one thing I thought of while you were talking was something amazing happened in the pandemic that few people commented on, which I thought was really an important sign, was people mostly on social media, or if you talk to them, I didn't want to see it written about very much. You had this phenomenon of people were home doing email jobs at home with their kids, and their kids were starting to play at those jobs, right? Play at sending emails, play at taking meetings, play at doing Zoom, play at making PowerPoints. And that's never happened before, right? The office, those kind of jobs were so displaced from the home that kids never played at them.
Mm-hmm.
Playing at your parents' occupations has been like a critical part of development for most of human history. And part of this kind of second oikos was the separation of that and the kind of channeling of child's play into like purely ethereal, like imaginative play and separate from work. But the third oikos, like the first oikos, might allow us to kind of bring that together again. So I thought that was a great sign.
Yeah, I love that too. And I just think it's going to be messy, but I think the alternative, we just really don't have an alternative. I mean, it's better than the alternative. It's like, yeah, I don't know. People say like democracy is the worst system of government ever devised, except for all the other ones kind of thing. It's just like, yeah, I mean, there's not a lot of good choices here, but we're going to have to just figure it out. Okay. So as we wrap up, I just want to hear the case for I know everybody who hovers around our circle loves this idea, but most of them do, I think. But the reintroduction of the megafauna, bison nationalism, the reintroduction of the American chestnut, how does it happen? And let's make the strongest case possible so I can send this to some kind of like VC funder and make it happen.
Well, the strongest case is that human modification of the environment, human destruction even of the environment didn't begin with the Industrial Revolution. It began with the extinction of the Siberian megafauna in like the 30,000, 40,000 BC.
Yeah.
Right. That's where you turn Siberia from a grassland. Like Siberia used to be grassland, and now it's all like this like weird swampy tundra with mosquitoes of all things. And it's because the megafauna, the woolly mammoth that made that possible, kind of went away. And is actually a huge contributor now to global warming. Similarly, the American grassland was produced by bison. There used to be bison from almost from coast to coast, and it really it fostered a very, like my understanding, very nitrogen-rich environment, huge CO2 sink, unbelievable amounts of natural protein available. Like these, early pioneers write about these just insanely large, tens and tens of thousands of bison roaming the plains, and so. And the American bison didn't go extinct, but almost went extinct. And there are other examples of these kind of extinctions. I mean, 25% of East Coast forests used to be the American chestnut before a fungus was brought from like Asia to the United States and basically killed the chestnuts. So the question is what to do about it. And there's a certain strand of environmentalists. The only way to do something about it is with genetic engineering. We have the technology now to reintroduce the chestnut's its own kind of case because there are living chestnut trees. They just can't reproduce. But it's a little bit different to basically get cultivars, modify them genetically, and then, for protection against this fungus, and then replant them. Whereas like the reviving the Siberian megafauna means like literally using actual mammoth DNA, a kind of mammoth elephant hybrid. That could be, it's like Jurassic Park type stuff. A Pleistocene Park, actually. There actually is a place in Siberia where they're laying the grounds for this, where they're trying to recreate the Paleolithic ecology. So a certain kind of environmentalist hears that and says, ooh, genetic modification, scary, we shouldn't do that. But that's not, so Stuart Brand, who's, a very interesting guy, has been a believer in this and says, he posed a question like, which is more conservative? Is it more conservative to not have the American chestnut, which, by the way, lived in this continent for tens and tens of thousands of years before we extinguished them like a century ago, or to bring them back, even if it means using some technology to do so? So again, if your heuristic is not technology icky, nature good, but is like, what is good? What is good for nature? What is good for man? Then you approach it with a very different set of questions. Mm-hmm. So I think we need to kind of full steam ahead on bison nationalism, which I'm going to be doing some more writing about maybe. Because it's good, because it'll be good.
Yeah, I think it would be good too. And part of my vision that I'm always fighting with people about is that I read this book. I didn't read tree crops early on, but I came across these like indigenous to most of the world, but I was reading about Europe and in particular these forest gardens where they like cultivated around their settlements, sometimes nomadic settlements, like cultivated trees, and then they would come back to those, and then they would specifically keep savannas open to be able to manage like grazing animals. This is like the obvious vision for us for agriculture, if with all the knowledge that we have, some kind of like corridors of tree crops where we manage giant herds and cull them would be like mind expandingly beautiful vision for agriculture. So yeah,
because the problem with environmentalism is it like poses it views, if modernity views the environment as like pure resource, which is awful. There's a kind of environmentalism which views the environment as just like perfect wild nature,
right,
that we need to restore and make pristine. And I mean, not only is that not true, it's also actually impossible. We've already so modified nature.
Yeah.
Like if you just like stopped everything today, and you stopped economic activity, you preserve nature, it would be a very degraded form of nature.
Yes.
Right? There are mosquitoes where there shouldn't be mosquitoes. There are species which are already extinct. There's been, forget the term, we've brought species from Asia to America that shouldn't have been brought there, right? And so if you just stop where we are, it's actually really bad. Like we have kudzu all over the American South. That's bad. So if you actually have a reparative view towards nature, it requires modifying it not with the view towards pure resource, but towards the view of what's actually good for it.
Yeah, I love that. Okay, Jon, I'll let you go. Thank you so much. This was lovely. I'm so glad we got to meet. You are anointed as a doomer optimist now, so you can join the community.
Well, what is on mine?
I know everybody in our circle is so cantankerous. Nobody will like just accept the label. They're like, I don't know what that is. I don't like labels, which I love. It's like the group that doesn't want to be a group. All right, Jon, have a good one. Thank you so much. This was lovely.
All right, thanks, Ashley.
All right, bye.
Bye.